All right. Well, welcome to the Deadly Analysis podcast. I think this is our third roundtable now. Wow, I feel like we're pros at this point. Today we're going to be talking about a horror movie, maybe even two. I guess we're going to kind of jump between two versions of kind of the same film. I hope I can say that without getting trashed. A Swedish film called Let the Right One In, which is about vampires, or a vampire, I should say. And an American version of that same film that came out 2 years later called Let Me In. And there's some key differences between the two films. So really what we want to do today is, for part of the discussion, explore some of the differences and how that affects sort of what we draw and what we pull from the films. And then also kind of discuss really just what these movies are about. I'm really excited about this discussion specifically because the last film that we talked about, and I think some of our intro to horror that we did in our first podcast, we talked about films that had very obvious and very specific elements that we could draw. So for example, in the It Follows discussion, you know, the film sort of, to all of us, was about the same sort of thing. It was about death, and it was about adolescence and sexuality. These were things that we sort of all agreed on fairly quickly. But this film has the propensity to be a little different. There may be some disagreement in this one, and I'm kind of looking forward to pursuing that a little bit. I have yet to see an interpretation of this film that is like mine, and that's rare for me. I almost feel dumb. I feel like I'm gonna sort of like talk about this film in a way that's not going to make sense to anybody. I think Josh holds some of the same views that I do. So I may not be alone. We may be the only people who feel this way. But anyway, I went to Google and I was looking for analysis of this film. I was looking for reviews that talked about the way I sort of view what these movies are about, and I found very little. So that's rare. So either I'm doing something incredibly ingenious or I'm a fucking idiot, and it may be the latter. So let's see what you guys think. I'm going to introduce, I have two people today with me. I probably should introduce you guys first. The first is Josh, who likes Let Me In. I think Josh actually read the book. So Josh is going to be our scholar here for the evening, because I have actually not read the book. But I have seen the Swedish film, and I've seen the American film. And then we're also here with Shayra, who's been on the last couple podcasts. And so I'm just going to throw out this question. I'll start with Josh. What did you think of the American film, Let Me In? Just pure thoughts from the very beginning, just general thoughts about the movie.
Okay, it's difficult to separate the thoughts from the American film when you have the book and you have the Swedish film in mind. I saw the American film after I saw the Swedish film and after I read the book, and it is so much a departure from both of those films that it's kind of difficult to. It was difficult for me to enjoy it. It was difficult for me to get into it. The movie itself, I think that it was shot well. I think that cinematically it worked, but I guess we'll probably get into the problems later. But I thought it was a mediocre film at best.
That's interesting. I mean, yeah. So just before I even jump to Shayra, it had Let the Right One In. The Swedish version has a 98% on Rotten Tomatoes, which is unbelievably high for horror films. And then the American version has an 88%, which is also very high. And you said something that we're going to kind of get to, which is which film you see first. I think it dictates a lot about which you're going to enjoy. But we'll get into that in a second. So what about you, Shayra? Did you see both? Did you see just the American? What did you think of the American?
saw both. I saw the Swedish version a long time ago, seen it many times since then, and I was afraid to watch the American version because I thought it would be garbage, and the only reason why I watched it was because you recommended it. So it wasn't horrible. I really love Hit Girl, so I mean, seeing her in a different role was fun. She's an amazing actress for a child actor. So and so was the boy who was in it as well. They were excellent actors. So one of the things I hate about most films with kids is the kids can never act, and you just, all you're doing is thinking, why is this kid here? I can't even tell this is a movie or get absorbed into it. I'm just sitting here analyzing their bad acting. Did not do that with this film. So the kids were excellent actors, but once again, I watched the Swedish version a long time ago, many times, and I prefer it definitely to the American version.
Yeah, so let me. I mentioned this in the podcast that I'm doing now on Let Me In. I'm dedicating it solely to the American version, but I'll kind of try really quickly to just explain to you guys why I chose the American version. I saw the American version first, so that's kind of weird. I saw the American version first and liked it. Went back and watched the Swedish version and liked it more. Right, so I actually agree with Josh and with you that the Swedish version overall I think is a better film. It's shot better. I enjoy the tones better. The music is better. Just everything about the film was more enjoyable. The connection between the I was going to say protagonist, but the main characters, I felt very heavily in the Swedish film, but the American version did something for me that the Swedish version didn't. And it was, I got more of the elements of like codependency and addiction. I got more of that from the American version of the film than I did from the Swedish version. And it is probably because I speak English. So I spent like the first 15 minutes of my podcast, I should say 15, I spent like the first few minutes of my podcast trying to defend myself essentially and get people to understand that like I love foreign horror movies. I love movies that have subtitles. They don't bother me. I'm not like an American idiot who just can't watch shit with subtitles. But I think for the sort of conversation that arose between the two characters and sort of their interaction and what it says about codependency and addiction, it felt more palatable to me that they were speaking I felt like I got it more, essentially. I felt like it was more raw to me and I could empathize a little more heavily because they were speaking my language. So when I say that, I run the risk of sounding like an idiot who's basically saying, he only likes it because he's an American. He doesn't watch those foreign films. And that's not entirely true. So I know most people disagree with that, right? Like Josh is going to look at me and say, no, he probably got those elements more from the Swedish film. I just didn't.
I think it's crazy because so Oscar's character was an incredibly important part of all of this because he had to portray this adolescent who was coming into his own, who was getting bullied at school by pretty nasty bullies and was having his first thoughts about sexuality, all those kind of things. He's growing up, and to be able for the actor to be able to capture that and do it well in the film was a critical aspect of it. And I think the Oscar in the American version was terrible. I don't think that he did a good job. I think he was bad at it. I think that that the real film came out and then an imposter came in and painted over all of the over everything that needs to be done. Like, okay, so we've got to make him get bullied, so we're going to do that in a very obvious way. We've got to make him be an adolescent and want to be enjoying girls here. Let's paint that and make that very obvious. Like it almost feels like the American film was dumbed down
I agree.
for the audience, and the real piece of art was the Swedish film. And so it's like looking at a Rembrandt and not seeing all the qualities of the Rembrandt in the Rembrandt and saying that's not a fucking Rembrandt, that's some imposter masquerading as a piece of art. So, and there was a lot of that in that film. It wasn't just with Oscar's character; it was with everyone else. I mean, when she bites the passersby and you know the entire her being twisted and turning into a vampire in the Swedish film was very well done. In the American film, it was just terrible. The effects
CGI.
the effects of the American film were awful. They were awful. They were not even barely passable. So that was one of the things that really threw me off about the American film, that did not throw me off about the Swedish film, because they used different kinds of effects and they used wires and they used things that made it that they were actually able to film the action of the movie without having it entirely be CGI. Like the scene where she's crawling up the hospital wall, and it was just like, come on, really? Did somebody draw that on there? And like, you're ruining the film for me. This is bad. So I think that the American film had a lot of moments that just threw me off. It wasn't just like, okay, I'm watching this as the American version of this film. It was, oh, that's terrible. Why didn't that get edited out? That part is awful. You're trying way too hard. Like in the beginning where he's got the mask on and he's like, yeah, you want to get stuck. And in the other one, it was just more visceral, more real, more adolescent. It felt like I was in the room with my brother, in the Swedish version. And I felt like I was looking at some car crash with the American.
So I definitely think, looking back at both of these films, the American film was unnecessary. Right, I'll start with that. It was unnecessary. The Swedish film was great. There are some, like, most of the American remake is actually almost a shot for shot redoing of the Swedish film. I was surprised that the majority of the scenes are almost exactly taken from Let the Right One In. I didn't know that until I went back and watched the Swedish version again right after watching the American version. Like, literally the same shots and almost the exact same dialogue. One of the other things that I heard when I was Googling this, I read something about this, and now I feel bad for not, like, pursuing it a little more, but basically there was some controversy about the Swedish subtitles being dubbed in English, that they even dumbed down the language. So in other words, when they were, like, transcribed, when they were when the subtitles were put onto the DVD, the ways in which sentences were described were essentially these simpler words, I guess, which kind of goes to what you're saying, Josh, that, like, it felt like a -1 version, like a diet version of the same thing. I totally get that. I'm very open to that interpretation. And I'd probably be sitting here agreeing with you if I had watched the Swedish version first. What about you, Shay? Did you feel the same way?
Yeah, I wrote notes while I was watching the American version, and most of them were jokes making fun of it. Um, my daughter and I were laughing our butts off. The CGI was so horrendous, just so bad. I can't even. We were laughing so hard. It was a comedy for us, especially, like he said, the crawling up the hospital walls.
Yeah.
We were laughing so hard, and also the noises when she was eating sounded like she was slurping soup. It was hilarious. We were laughing throughout the sound effects and the CGI. The snow was fake. The snow was so unbelievably fake. I mean, he's eating the now and laters, and you see him, like, putting dust over the wrappers, and I'm like, this is ridiculous. I understand that fake snow is used a lot in movies, but it's not necessary. And the Swedish version had real looking snow, or was real snow, and I think that adds to the elements of the blood getting into the snow, and making it scary and frightening and lonely and empty feeling, as opposed to looking like a set in a play for a kid's play. It took away from the film so much with all the fake stuff. And here's the thing, CGI can look amazing. There are so many films that do amazing CGI, and this one did not do it. It was horrible, horrible CGI and horrible fake everything. The blood didn't even look that good. That's another. I'm a huge fan of fake blood, and I like it to look really good. I didn't think their blood was good. I'm trying to think. Oh, the other thing, when the woman was in the hospital and they moved the curtains and she lit on fire, that fire was so fake looking and
And it's
so
like
ridiculous
Adobe
looking.
After Effects. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I could do better in Adobe After Effects. I really do. It was so bad. So it took away from it, because part of that movie was a comedy to Kylie and I. We're
Yeah,
sitting there
which is
laughing.
sad, right? I mean, like, the film had a higher budget, well, a much higher budget than the Swedish version of the film. It was almost like they Donald Trumped it. You know what I mean? Like, they took a great piece of art, and, like, to get you to understand it, like, they dumbed it down. I agree with you. I totally understand that. And the snow, I think that one of the things you mentioned is important. Not just the fact that the snow looked less real, but one of the things that I noted is that the snow sort of reflected the changes in the atmosphere of both films, right? So that was me trying to segue. So, like, the snow, the snow in the Swedish version tends to fall slower. It's a lot more calming, which I think adds to the sense of dread throughout the entirety of the movie. Whereas in the American version, it's very fast and it's chaotic, and, like you said, it doesn't look real. So it has the effect of sort of cheapening the atmosphere of the film, and then also just giving a completely different sort of vibe to when you see them talking out in the playground, for example, or going out on a date, which I thought was unnecessary. I mean, it's like they took some of the things that made the Swedish version great, and those were the things that they decided to change. But they kept other things in that seemed kind of unnecessary and did a shot-for-shot remake of them. So that was kind of weird to me. I completely agree with you guys. Again, I think the only reason I really pulled for the American to do a review from it is where I disagree with Josh is I felt like the addictive elements and the codependency stuff was a lot more richer in the American version. So let me give you one of the reasons why I think that. In the Swedish version, there's a much heavier adult presence. So you have those people at the bar, right? You have the lady with the cats. There's more adults in functioning in the Swedish film. Oscar, for example, has a better relationship with his mom and with his dad when his dad's not drinking in the Swedish version. In the American version, the adults are distant and they're aloof, and Owen, for lack of a better way of putting it, sort of looks in on adults, right? What is he doing when he's in his room? He's using that telescope and looking in. They're distant from him, and I think that adds to his isolation. It adds to the fact that he's got a gap, he's got a void that needs to be filled, and Abby's going to fill it, right? Or Ellie's going to fill it. And I felt that draw a little heavier in the English version because of just little subtleties like that. I guess they're not really even subtleties, and just differences in the way it was filmed and decisions made about what to keep in and what to take out.
You know what I wrote down?
Yeah.
I said I said that the mom was blurred out and distorted in a lot of scenes in this film, and it reminds me of It Follows. And I said maybe these films are so maybe Noah's so drawn to these films because he also feels that kind of loneliness and emptiness from the adults in his life from his childhood. So maybe that's why he's more drawn to It Follows and to this version of Let Me In or whatever. I'm just psychoanalyzing you based on this now.
Please
so.
send.
I wrote it down.
I know. That was like I literally was about to take a drink, and then I thought for a moment. I'm like, I was gonna make a joke, but then I realized like you're probably right. No, that's a really good point. Maybe that's what it is, right? Maybe I'm working out my stuff. Let me like turn off my camera and start weeping. Yeah. There are even some sequences with the mom, I think, in particular, is blurred out, kind of like It Follows in a lot of sequences. That's wild.
Yeah, there's a scene, and that this is the scene that made me write this down about you. But there's a scene where you see the mom, and she looks really weird and distorted, and I was like, this is almost exactly like It Follows, mom. So, and then there's the alcohol references and things like that too. So it's substance abuse and
Yeah.
Fading into the background, and the adults are just not necessarily caretakers.
Wow,
in their own world.
As introspective as I consider myself, and as loud as I like to be about how well I know myself, I literally did not put that together. That is a really, really wild thing to think about. I'm going to be thinking about that as soon as we turn this off. That is really interesting. I have no idea how to segue out of that, so someone needs to say something else because that is
you talked about the codependency aspect of this film, and I think that is the most important part of this entire story. Because once you get it, once you understand that her companion was once a boy who she seduced and that they were in love for a period of time, and it always ends, you realize that she's in this cycle of manipulation. She needs another caretaker, and she knows that this is the vehicle to do it, but she's torn about it, which is fantastic to me, that she's not like deliberately going out there and like, I don't give a fuck, whatever, it doesn't matter, this is what I need to survive. They gave her this vampire some humanity, which I think is amazing. I think it's incredible that she felt badly about having to do this to boys that were apparently her age, and going forward into the future kind of trap them into this love with her that she knows is futile, that she knows will end one day in somebody's horribly scarred acid face sucking all their blood out before they're dead. She knows that that's the end. So I think that part of what made Ellie's character amazing to me, especially in the Swedish version, which was just brilliantly fucking acted, was to show that kind of adult perspective, or to be able to act from that kind of adult perspective as a juvenile, which I was just amazed at. And the book, the reason why I think the Swedish version represents the book more, it's kind of like watching Schindler's List, right? You watched it once and you're like, you hit the end of the movie and you're like, God, fuck that, God, fucking movie, it just killed me. And 5 years later you revisit it, it's the same fucking movie, get it out of here. It fills you with a sense of dread the entire time. Nothing can happen in that movie without you feeling that impending doom, and I think that that's what the Swedish film really captured about the book, because the book is far more dark than either of the two movies. It goes into the sexual relationship that she has with her caretakers. It goes into like all kinds of different aspects of pedophilia and vampirism. It talks about stuff in great detail. If you haven't read the book, I highly recommend you reading it. But I think that it would Let the Right One In was one of the movies that I think, from the perspective of the original story, told the best story in film, and it used it through art and amazing acting, which is why I love it so much. But that codependency aspect of the film is the entire point of the book, Let the Right One In and Let Me In. That whole thing all surrounds that, and I didn't want to feel like it was in my face the whole time. I wanted to gradually get that out of it, which I did with Let the Right One In. But with Let Me In, it was kind of like, okay, it's right in your face. This is what the story is. This is where we're going with it. And it didn't let me think for myself.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was going to point out the difference, a major difference between the two films is that you're right. Ellie, there's a sense of a little bit more of remorse in Ellie than there is in Abby. With Abby in the American version, she has zero remorse. I mean, her face, she is never remorseful at any point in that entire film. Like now when I go back and I look at the film, the American film, right? Every sequence with Abby and Owen has some element of her trying to manipulate his emotional frailty. Every single scene. So I had a debate with this person who swore that even by the end of the film, right? This is one of the most heated debates I've ever had in my life. I actually, like, I'm not friends with the guy anymore. And this part of the reason is this debate. He actually argued that their relationship was in part healthy and that it was like a really loving, there was still love in there between both of them, not just from Owen to Abby, but Abby to Owen. And it's just, if that's what you walk away with when you watch this movie, you have been fucking played. You have been had, right? Everything about this movie is about the fact that you can love someone and fall for someone and be pushed to someone for all the wrong reasons. That you have the psychological capacity to not understand the voids that you have and to let people who shouldn't be filling them fill them, and to be, to be connected to those people and need to feed their addiction, right? I mentioned in my podcast, I was watching Intervention like a year ago on television, and there was a guy who his wife was addicted to alcohol. I mean, just awfully addicted to the point where she was going to die within a year. And whenever she would start to get withdrawals, he would give her alcohol. He just felt bad, and he didn't want to take her in and do it the right way. So he would just give her a bottle of vodka, right? And I mean, and to me, it's like there's something like that in this film. You could almost swap out blood for heroin, right, in the American film, and I think a lot of the pool would still be the same.
No, I mean, this is one of the things that I kind of enjoy about the whole entire story is when you see that there's that element of substance abuse or that element of manipulation in a relationship, and a lot of people might look at that and go, "Aw." I mean, this is what normal people do. You know, people tend to get in toxic relationships all the time, and think that it's a good relationship for them. So that happens all the time. So I don't think it's that far off for people to interpret it that way, because some people can't interpret relationships properly. But it is kind of sad in a way, because then you're wondering what kind of relationship this guy has if he's arguing that.
It's fucking crazy to me. That's why it's a horror film.
Mm-hmm.
That is absolutely why it's a horror film, because this person, while in the book and in the Swedish film, she did feel remorse about having to do this, but she knew she needed to do it. She deliberately manipulated this person who was weak, who got bullied, who didn't have the constitution for friends or being outgoing or was socially awkward. She knew exactly who she needed going forward, and she picked him because she knew that he would be her caretaker forever, or for as long as he would be alive. And that is what is terrifying about the movie to me.
Yeah, this movie, the vampire shit was nowhere near the stuff that was supposed to be scary. At least that's what I got from this, especially in the American version. I almost wished all of the scenes where Abby turned into a vampire would just, I could fast forward them and just get to their dialogue sequences, because I felt like that's where I was starting to feel uneasy. I was starting to feel like something was amiss, like something was wrong, right? Like
you had secondhand embarrassment for the fucking terrible CGI is what it was. Like, get it out of here. I don't want to see this part.
Yeah. But you're totally right. Like, that's, to me, that's why it's a horror film. That's absolutely right to me. One of the things that I thought was really interesting, that sort of magnified why I felt the pull more from the American version, is that they never name the father figure of Abby in the American version, right? In the book and in the Let the Right One, and he has a name, he has a background, and in the American version, you don't even know his name. You really have no idea about his background other than he's in a black and white photo with Abby. And I felt like that was extremely purposeful. Judging all of the other things we've been saying so far, I could probably completely be wrong by that, and it's probably a happy coincidence because they had no idea what the fuck they were doing when they made the American version, but whatever. He didn't have a name. And I felt like that really, to me, that sort of spoke to the fact that relationships can take a back seat when you're in these kind of toxic relationships, when you're in a relationship where one person, for example, is addicted to drugs. When a person is so addicted to drugs, it doesn't matter how long you've been with someone else, you will use them as a means to an end. And that was magnified by the fact that we just didn't know this guy's name. I mean, that's kind of like saying it doesn't matter if you've been with Abby or Ellie for 30, 40 years, right? You're not important. You're a means to an end. And there's a very heavy degree of truth in that when you look at relationships where there are one or more parties addicted to substances, addicted to drugs rather. So I don't know, I thought that was an interesting difference, that one of the few things I liked about the American version more than the Swedish version.
There was one thing that really pissed me off above all the other things, and it's the stupid subtlety that pissed me off. But in the Swedish version, when Oscar goes into their apartment, she's got all this stuff, right? She's got the money, she's got all kinds of stuff that she's collected, and there's this really mysterious, cool fucking thing that she says. She looks over at him, she says, "That's, that could buy this whole city or something if you were to sell it." And it was this awesome thing. And I was looking for those things in her apartment in the American version, and she just had a bunch of bullshit. She had like a couple of puzzles and nothing that was interesting. And I was like, that to me, it's a crucial aspect of this, because she's still got to lure him in. She's still at that point luring him. I mean, she's got her claws in him, but it's part of the movie and part of the book, for that matter, that really mystifies Oscar. It really mystifies me. It's like, holy shit, this is real. She's really this fucking special person. And he hasn't, when she said, "I'm not really a man," or "I'm not really, what would you do if I wasn't a girl," or "I'm not really a woman." That is just, it went into his head and just bounced right out. It doesn't matter. Like, and I guess the American version, it did a little bit too, but he still, that aspect of it, he still needed to be drawn in. She still needed to build the fantasy in him in order to manipulate him to fall in love with her.
Yeah, the other thing that exact scene did is it magnified the flip that these two films and the book give you about what it means to be a vampire, right? Because you have this idea of vampires, when you think of this sort of general mythology of them, as these creatures of the night that are like free to roam the countryside, attack whomever they choose. They live freely, right? And you have that entire thing flipped, where now you have vampires that are isolated to a rundown apartment where everything is dark and somber, and it's like you're living in a home with attics, right? But at the same time, Ellie has one of these things that she could clearly sell to sort of not be in a situation like that, which I thought, to me, kind of impressed even more so the odd flip that this movie gives you about what it means to be a vampire, right? It hones in on that perspective that's specifically about the need for blood. That's what I got from that. The other thing is, I like the idea of it not being the same fucking puzzle. Like in the American version, you go into the home and it's a Rubik's Cube, right? Like in the Swedish version, it's not a Rubik's Cube. The thing they're playing with earlier, right, in the American version is an archaic version of the same toy when he goes in. And I just thought, you could not try to be telling me any more clearly what you're trying to tell me. Like I may be dumb because it took me a couple times to get this from your film, but I'm not that dumb.
I thought that the part where they repeated the elements that they would show later on was unnecessary. I thought that that you could have cut out a lot of the initial elements and then just let the viewer sort of discover those on their own, rather than coming upon them a second time and going, "Oh, look, that's what was going on," But other than that, I thought it was very well shot. I would believe you when you say that that it's shot for shot identical to its predecessor in a lot of ways. It had a very comic book like feel to me in the way that it was framed. It was framed in a very specific way, and almost every shot was lit with a very high contrast, such that if you were to run it through a filter or whatever, you could get that comic book look really easily. It would look really sharply defined. It would look like Sin City or what have you, almost. It's an extremely high contrast film. Again, as with It Follows, I was really impressed with the performances of the relatively young actors. I thought I'm almost always disappointed with people in the 18 and under set as far as acting performances, because they just don't have enough life experience to replicate other roles that well usually. Um, but these kids really brought it home. It was really nice. Um, I thought it was kind of funny how they actually went to like really extreme lengths to, although it's a sort of a romance between the two main characters. Um, I think it was really funny how they took pains to avoid showing anything that could potentially be considered titillating or what have you. Like they framed the shots, and then they just made sure that everything was erased. Everything was blurred out or blacked out or what have you. I do think that there's a lot of contemporary framing as far as the codependency goes. But as far as sort of the primal scream of the film, to not put too fine a point on it, I think that it was very Romeo and Juliet / Hatfield and McCoy kind of thing. It's about it's not it may be about drugs indirectly, but more directly, it's about how humans always fuck their relationships up horribly and end up in relationships that like don't make sense, or that they shouldn't be in, or that are damaging to them, or are tragic in some way. And so that's what I mean when I say Romeo and Juliet. It's very um Abby is very much a Capulet or what have you. You know what I mean? um where we're from two different worlds. We are drawn to one another in some way. It cannot be, but we're going to try and make it work, but it's going to end up in this like really tragic way anyway. And our movement toward one another is going to erode our potential in some way.
So let me interject right there. Do you really think that Abby was drawn to Owen? This is the debate of this film. This is the I think the disagreement. Do you really think that at all Abby was drawn to Owen?
Yeah, I think this is one of these things where it's a both and rather than an either or. I think that this is one of those elements where um almost totemically you end up choosing your next host, so to speak. You know what I mean? Like this is an organism. Abby is an organism with a very specific sort of lifestyle. Can't have sunlight, requires a certain amount of food, looks like the food. Blah 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 blah. And so one of the rules of her universe is that she's got a caretaker, a butler, so to speak, an Alfred, right? And so she goes through life with Alfred, and that's how she manages. And so when Alfred dies, you find a new Alfred. It's like Robin. There's more than one Robin in the Batman series. Um, when one Robin leaves, then you find another Robin. But it's not, you don't just put out a casting call or whatever. You know what I mean? There's an element of mutual connection. You find someone else who connects with you in a particular way that reminds you of the old Robin, and then now you're bound together, and now you're going to walk together through life.
I'm going to differ almost entirely with that, because I don't think I think that the only thing that she saw that was alluring about her new host was that she could manipulate him into feeding her. I think that's all there was. I don't think that there was any love. I don't think there was any compassion. I don't think there was any devotion. I don't think that there was any allure. I don't think there was anything emotional on Ellie's side to want to be with this person. I think she identified the proper host, and she manipulated the proper host into staying with her for the rest of his life. And when he reached a certain point or couldn't perform his duties anymore, then he was just discarded, which is kind of what happened throughout the entire course of the film. And I think that the only thing that she felt, or the only thing that they tried to portray her to feel in the Swedish movie and in the book, was remorse for having to do this so many times. But they also expressed it in the book as frustration of having to do it so many times, which is why she appears to be so melancholy and can fit into that role as the manipulator. But so yeah, it's a mixture of frustration and a smidge of remorse. But as far as a feeling of a connection or love or allure, anything of that sort, I think it is entirely absent.
Well, where I drew that from was where the previous Alfred, um, pours acid on his face to avoid being identified. Um, and that's an incredible act of like self-sacrifice, right? It's an act of loyalty, right? Maybe even an ultimate act of loyalty. And so you have to ask yourself, why would he do this for her?
Because
right? And
yeah,
it's not accounted for in the film why he would do this for her, what their connection was such, because she specifies he's not her father. We don't know what their relationship is other than that. And yet he's got this supreme loyalty. He's willing not only to kill for her, right? But he's also willing to mutilate himself and go through incredible agony for an extended period of time for her. He's willing to suffer for her. And so why is he so devoted? What is it that is binding him to her? What is it that is binding them together?
And
So,
yeah, I think that's why it's
the guy's
I think
old,
yeah, I think it's why it's a horror film. Because the reason why he's devoted to her is because she has made him devoted to her, so he'll continue to serve her and to serve her needs. She can make him believe that she has this connection. She manipulates him into believing that there's this connection. So that's what he owns. He feels that he is devoted in that way, to the point of self-sacrifice and self-mutilation, because he's not a vampire. He hasn't experienced this kind of thing before, and she knows what works, which is why she manipulates him and why she knows who to choose, especially in the character of Oscar.
No, I think that when it comes to the manipulations and stuff, a lot of us can relate because I think a lot of us have been manipulated in that way. We've fallen for people's traps in that way before, and it can be really sad. It's a sad thing, but sometimes even when you know that you're doing it or they're doing it, you still go with it even though you know. And I think that's the most interesting and scary part of the movie is that he had to have realized that that was what was happening to him, but he was like, I like her, whatever.
Yeah, that's even worse, right? Like the
Yeah.
moment you realize you are being taken advantage of, you go, like
Oh,
that.
wow.
That's the whole fucking horror movie. Right
And
there.
that's when the truly terrifying moment happens, when you realize that this other guy had been in the exact same situation. He has to know where his end is now. He has to know what his future holds for him, and he's like,
Yeah,
I
he's like,
like her.
well, I think in a deeper level too. I think he doesn't understand that he needs the things that she's offering, right? Like he's drawn to them in a certain way. I agree with Josh just with the level of duplicity between Abby and Ellie. A true story. As soon as I got done watching this movie, my wife asked me to go get coffee for her at Starbucks. And I was just like, I looked at her and I was like, I just overanalyzed everything for that day. I overanalyzed my conversations with her, my phone call with my friends. I had a buddy ask me for money. It's never happened to me in my life. Like I literally have never had a friend ask me for money. The moment that movie was over, I had a friend ask me for money. And I was like, he's like a good friend. So I was like, am I being taken advantage of? Like, should I go get my wife coffee? Like she has a caffeine addiction, like Ellie and Abby. Like all this shit's going through my head. And I really was interesting because it really makes you, I think the applicable part of it, right, is to understand that we have I think I said this earlier, we have the propensity to be attracted to people for the wrong reasons and to fall into traps without realizing we're falling into them, without seeing our mental frailty, our psychological frailty. Most people don't think about these things. And the fact that you could be a thoughtful person and miss this stuff is scary. But the fact that like most people probably will go their lives not ever even thinking about this as something that's possible that they could be doing that they're not understanding that they're doing, that's really scary to me. I don't know.
Well, you actually see these kinds of relationships in reality. I can't tell you how many times I've heard the story of a woman who is extremely obese, can't even move off the couch, and she has a partner who's just continuously feeding her more and more and more food, like buys her tons and tons of food, and she gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and they have to get a wall cut out to remove her from the building to get her the help she needs after that. And it's the exact same kind of relationship. You're enabling this person, they have a problem, they're not good for you, they're using you, and you stay in those relationships. So it's part of reality. They took a fictional horror element to it, but it is horrifying in a way because you're enabling someone and you're hurting other people based off of that too.
There's a couple scenes that really play with you in this regard. So the scene at the end of the movie where Abby kills the police officer and then she tells Owen, look, I gotta leave, right? That is manipulative in and of itself, right? She gives and then she takes away, clearly, right? She knows she's got Owen already, so she leaves. And that scene where she leaves, she gets into the cab by herself. You see Owen upstairs, and I believe this is the same version. The same thing happens in Let the Right One In. But you see Owen weeping and crying, and he's unbelievably, he's just broken by this. And I remember the first time watching the film feeling bad too. Like I felt bad for Owen. I felt like I felt bad that he didn't have Abby anymore. And I went back and thought about it. And I thought, how fucked up is that? That as an audience member, I'm almost complicit now that I look back and I go, because think about it, like Abby's the worst thing that could happen to Owen. The worst possible thing that could happen to Owen is Abby coming into his life. And yet you feel bad for him. The film makes you feel bad for him. It makes you feel somber that his only friend, his only person that he can confide into throughout the film, his only buddy leaves him. And I look back on that and I thought that was just very well done in terms of how it was shot and how it was written, because it made me feel bad. And the fact that I feel bad about it is kind of like part of the lesson. I think that's part of the lesson in there, is that it's that easy.
For some unknown reason, the bully, I feel he was a homosexual that was hating on other homosexuals or people he perceived to be homosexual, or was using homophobia to like hide his homosexuality, because there was a lot of homophobic crap he was throwing around at this kid. And then on top of it, when Owen was talking to the predator, she was like, what if I wasn't a girl? There was all these weird little elements where I'm like, I wonder if they're throwing that in there in the American version, trying to throw in the what homophobia does when you're trying to figure out your sexuality, when you're trying to figure out who you're attracted to during that time in that age. But then it might just have been a fluke and just randomness.
I think that's right. I think that they did another thing in the American version that they didn't do in the other version, which was they kind of showed the element of the bully being beaten up by his older brother at home in the American version. And in the Swedish version, that didn't exist. The bully was the bully, and he had a brother who was a criminal and who, could kill Oscar. But in the American version, I don't think their dynamic worked at all. His buddies were like, "Hey, what are you doing? We got to go to class." Like, and he seemed really melodramatic in his acting. In the American version, I think the bully was one of the worst acted parts in that film. But they did try to explain that, and I think that's interesting, and it's something that I hadn't considered about the latent homosexuality. But also, and they did try to overtly state that this was a troubled kid. And here's the reason why this kid is troubled. He beats up on kids at school because he himself is beat up at home by his siblings and by whoever else is there. So that's an interesting aspect.
I think it's actually a lot more than that, because there's really they use really specific coding to sort of signal that there's a cycle of violence, right? The film opens with Owen going, talking about, what are you going to do now, little girl, like waving the knife around and shit like that. And then we see that he learned this from the bully who beats him up and calls him little girl. And then we see that he learned it from his older brother who beats him up and calls him little girl, right? So it's not just between two characters, it's between three. And there's a clear like path of descent. And I think that's actually one of the major themes of the movie is the notion of this sort of these cyclic cycles of violence and manipulation and dependency and sort of a symbiotic but negatively symbiotic relationship, right? It's not a parasitic relationship because um, Abby doesn't only take away from Owen, right? She does give him some things he needs. She gives him attention. She gives him a confidant. At one point, she basically saves his life. Um, and she counsels him to become more of the sort of person who you know can stay safer from what's going on. Although again, it's implied that this is in its own way a perpetuation of a cycle of violence. But there's definitely an ancestral, almost like original sin element to it, where things get passed down. Owen ends up in the role that is of Alfred or what have you. It's passed down. And this is because of a cycle of violence that was perpetuated through a chain of several different people in an identical way until it reached a new conduit.
Yeah, so if I could add to that, I think to that extent, the fact that it's cyclical in many different ways throughout the film, there's different ways in which different things are cyclical, like the way you just described. I think that speaks to something almost like what we were talking about in It Follows, something that's core to the, I think you put it perfectly, something that's core to the human experience. Not necessarily always there, like maybe in It Follows, everyone dies, right? But in Let Me In and in Let the Right One In, the capacity to develop toxic relationships between other people, and doesn't need to even be sexual relationships, but the capacity to develop those is sort of embedded into the human experience and our social relations, right? So the cycles of violence and all of that, I think, speaks to something that is sort of solidified in terms of the human experience, something that anyone could adopt in any culture, like not just over here in the West, but like it's something that can happen anywhere, between any relationship. It could happen between parents and kids. It could happen between friends. It could happen between lovers, right?
And there's also an element of this even in another axis that's exposed in the movie, and that's where Ellie attacks the older woman and puts her in the hospital, and then she ends up, because she almost dies from the attack, she ends up becoming a vampire herself and then burns away in the light. And on the one hand, this is used as a narrative purpose to introduce the fact that light is a problem, and that this is going to have this explains some things that you've seen in the movie. But in a more profound way, what that shows is it makes you ask, okay, so this is how they're made. So that means that this is what happened to Abby at some point, right? That Abby at some point woke up and went, oh, and was, oh shit, I was just killed by something, and now I'm alive in another, way. You know what I mean? Like this is something that she went through as well. This incredibly traumatic experience that she went through as she realized she was, awake again with the beast within now, right? So, this again sort of points to the ancient roots that the film wants you to feel for everything that's happening in the movie. This everything that's happened in the movie has already happened a bunch of different times before, right? And we're just viewing the newest iteration of this inevitable cycle. And so I guess it's a kind of a Lovecraftian horror in that sense.
Where in the film did you think Abby had Owen? In other words, like what scene in the film, or right around what particular part of the movie, did you feel like she's got Owen locked in?
When he clobbers what's his face with the stick.
That's the scene that did it for you. That's when, because you're so right after that scene, what happens, right? He runs to Abby and he's kind of like, he's got bated breath and he's like, I did it. Was that sort of what you're referring to? Like with the fact that she's almost proud that he's going to tell her, maybe instead of his mom or something.
It was the choice to break from his previous cycles. That was the indication that now there's a new dynamic, it was where he finally snapped right inside. And so that was definitely the moment where he finally snapped, where he was like, not like this, not again. I'm gonna do it differently this time. I'm gonna try something else.
I think the bloody kiss, once that bloody kiss was planted, I'm like, okay, he's hooked, because I don't know if I could make out with, even no matter how much I like somebody, I don't think I could make out with them with the their face just full of blood like that. So I think he was hooked at that moment. But I don't know, maybe there was something to that bloody kiss that made it somehow important in the story, some kind of metaphor to it that I don't understand.
Well, it's very the scene you're referring to, right? Is close to the end of the film. I originally thought that's what I would have said at first until I watched the film a couple of times. By the way, that scene that you just mentioned, right, is like sort of the perfect image of a codependent relationship. Just she wraps her bloody arms around him like this, and then she kisses him on the lips, and it's this toxic, messed up, fucked up thing. But under it, there's a kiss, right? There's something beautiful there, but it's just devalued heavily because of all of the corn syrup on top. What about you, Josh?
I think I'm going to differ with everybody here, and maybe it's just because the American version was just so crappy. But because I couldn't really tell. He seemed infatuated with her the moment she touched his Rubik's cube. Like I think that any girl showing him any kind of attention whatsoever, and wanting to be interested in the things that he was interested in, I think she had him at the cube. But then there were other scenes where he's like stabbing the tree and he's like, "Go away. I don't want to talk to you." And you could tell it was kind of disingenuous. Like he was looking after her when, wondering where she went. He wanted her to still be watching him. So I think he was hooked from the very beginning.
Yeah. I was gonna say you think he was hooked very early. I think Shayra thinks he was hooked fairly late. I'm somewhere around Antonio. I'm trying to think of where it is compared to him. But basically, the scene where she shows him what happens if she's let in without being let in, without saying you can come in, right? And she starts bleeding profusely. The look on Owen's face when she does that is everything to me, right? He stops and he says, "No, you can come in," and he gives her a big hug. And he said, the dialogue goes something like this. He says, like, "What would have happened if I just wouldn't have said anything?" Right? And her response was, "I knew you wouldn't let that happen." Or like, "I knew you wouldn't have let me do that," or something. And that's when I knew, like, you got to think, like, this is a vampire who's been around hundreds of years, who's done this many times before. That's essentially, I think that's the moment where she knew, I got this guy.
I think the beautiful thing about this entire story is that they take that older vampire taking advantage of these younger people that haven't been around for very long. I think they've really managed to portray that properly, because you watch movies like Twilight and even some of the good Anne Rice stuff, and you feel like they sexify these vampires, and that it's like, ooh yeah, come hang out with me. It's not weird and creepy that I'm actually 1,000 years old. They make sure that you know that it's creepy. What she's doing is predatory. What she's doing is creepy and wrong.
So I'm going to give it a 6.5 out of 10. What about you guys?
The American version, I'd give a 6 out of 10. There were definitely some interesting elements to it, and like we talked about, the way that the bullies were portrayed in the American version, definitely interesting to me. Definitely a good spin to it. Otherwise, it would be much lower, because my God, the CGI in Fake Snow was just comedy for me. But no, there were some elements that really stood out for me, so I'll give it a 6 out of 10.
Antonio, say 11. I want you to say 11 right now. 11 out of 10.
I'm going to say 11, but I am going to say 7.5.
Wow.
And the reason is because first of all, it's a philosophical work, and anything that's a philosophical work automatically bumps it up at least a point in my book, because so few movies are self-aware and try to ask hard questions like that. Even the ones that do are very heavy-handed with the message, and I feel like the message here was pretty subtle. Like you can derive a bunch of different themes out of the movie, and it's because it has this primality to it, right? And I'm from this and It Follows, I'm noticing a pattern in sort of movies that you're pointing out. There's a lot of coming of age themes, a lot of primality, and a lot of nihilism.
So
are you ready to hear the most horrifying thing about this film?
Okay, yes.
And this will be just, I guess, a running gag with all this stuff. But the most horrifying thing about this film that I found out was that the actors that played in this film, the young boy, is the same age as my husband.
Oh. That's it.
And when I saw that, I was like, damn, this is not working for me.
That's it. Podcast is over. Good night, everybody. That's it. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's wild. That's a horror movie unto itself.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God.
So yeah, I was looking up some stuff on IMDb in the middle of the movie, and I'm like, oh fuck this movie.
Yeah, it was made a long time ago. It was
Yeah.
made a long time ago. Jesus, that is. Yeah, we're old. You know what? We just got to go back and watch It Follows again, and just be reminded we're gonna die soon. You know, damn.
That's the beauty of this movie too, though. This movie is also a very much a we're all eventually going to die kind of movie, because it does have the, like I said, it does have that cyclic nature to it, and it points out that, you know, what's going to happen to Owen. He's going to end up, you know, with his face acid burned to getting the blood drained out of him and dumped off a building one of these days. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
you come of age, then you get manipulated, and then you get sucked dry, and then you die.
I feel like my closing thing about this movie is that it's really a I would say it's a morality play. It's not really a morality play. It's a movie that it's a much better way to put it. It's a tragedy that makes you, like all tragedies, consider the human condition to some degree, right? To consider your place in the universe, and I think in this case, in how you exist with people around you. And that in it, just for me, that in itself is uncomfortable. Like, I just hate even thinking about those sorts of things. How I look to other people, how I come off to other people. Am I treating other people the right way? Are they treating me the right way? I get anxiety when I think of my place in the world in terms of how I function in society as a husband, or as a provider, or as a friend, or as a brother. And so there's already sort of an anxiety for me when I think of those things, and it's only manifest when I think about the fact that I could be doing things I'm not aware of that are hurting me or those around me, and I'm not only not aware of it, but they're not aware of it. That's a scary thought. So I may not sleep for 4 days, and I may take vigorous notes about how I need to be more skeptical of my relationships. This may have scarred me. I'm just going to throw that out.
Well, that's almost the opposite of kind of my closing thought, which is that there's almost a comforting element to the movie, and that is that you know, toxic though it may be, um, we we are in, you know, cycles that we have less control over than, and less knowledge of than we suspect, and also even the weirdest and most picked on and most outcast of us can find ways to get our itches scratched, as it were. You know, we can find places where we fit, and relationships where um we're serving a need and getting a need met, even if it's toxic. You know what I mean? And there is kind of a comforting element to that, because it means that, you know, yes, everything is chaos and we're all falling into an endless void, but there's nothing you can do about it. And your place was in the stars, was sort of was set long before you were yourself in motion, and so you can just kind of let yourself coast into the endless dark. And
That
there's
is
the comforting
wow.
part of horror.
I don't know how that's comforting, but okay.
That's like a Hitchcock fucking, like, that's you literally just like you wrote Edgar Allan Poe's next greatest hit right there, and you're saying it's comforting. Yeah, wow. We look at things very different, Antonio. I like that.
Yeah, that was dark, dude. And it says a lot about you because you enjoy the dark. Apparently, you embrace the darkness.
Who knew?
This film, it makes me really question myself at times, because I am a very compassionate person. I try to empathize with others, and sometimes that is a very bad thing, because some people are manipulating me, some people are lying to me. I can't tell you how many times I've tried to help somebody out, and it's been a very toxic situation that's happened to me. It's happened so many times. And I've, in my old age, become a bitter old person. I'm like, whatever, die then. I don't care, starve, you know? Like, I'm not trying to be a jerk about it, but once you've been through those manipulative situations so many times, you can spot them. And in this film, just portrayed it perfectly, and I so much relate to the characters, because I can't tell you how many times people manipulated me in that way. But in a way, it is positive, because I look at it and go, I don't do that anymore. That's cool. Like, I've grown out of that, and you know, maybe that's my coming of age story, is learning how to not be manipulated in that way. And maybe we could even, you know, imagine that in the future he figures it out and gets away from that relationship. maybe he can grow out of it. But I doubt it, considering how hooked he was. But no, it helped me reflect a little bit on some of my past and how I've grown as a person.
Well, thank you guys so much for taking the time to do this. For all those that are watching, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Deadly Analysis. You can check out our YouTube page at deadlyanalysis.com and shoot us a like on Facebook. Our next roundtable discussion will be on the horror movie Creep, which is not my autobiography. It is not a story about me, but it could be. So anyway, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys next time.